and to my great joy, I came out to the same endpoint as if I'd done it using religion, but it gives me an additional set of tools to argue to argue against euthanasia and for life in the world in general. And as if to make it more convincing, my supervisor, who was a well-known Australian philosopher, Peter Singer, didn't agree with a word I wrote. But he was such a good supervisor, he made me argue it rigorously, and that was very important, actually. Now, in terms of euthanasia, there's a lot of definitions, but what we're actually talking about today is two things. When you talk about active euthanasia, it's death caused by direct action or deliberate inaction intended to cause death. And we are usually talking about voluntary euthanasia, which would be death at the express wish of a patient, because it would be a rather difficult situation if we had involuntary euthanasia where the patient didn't wish it at all. The term I want to talk about to debunk a little bit later on is passive euthanasia, because this is a term that's not very helpful, given that what happens is people use treatment withdrawal in a setting where the treatment won't have any impact and in fact is a burden, to name it some type of euthanasia, to claim a sort of consistency. Oh, well, if you support proper treatment withdrawal in the right situation, then you should support all sorts of euthanasia. So we've got to avoid that trap. Now, Victoria, as you know, has legislated for voluntary assisted dying, and I'm part of a group that will be got an NHMRC grant, actually, to study what happens when you do that. It's going to be very difficult because it's hard to know where to get the information from, actually. But anyway, you won't be able to get it off the death certificate. But I think the issues that come when you try and frame legislation, for whom would it be available, but more importantly, can we assure that people will have the best alternatives? In other words, before we ever come to that, can we assure that every person in our state will have excellent palliative care and counselling? Because that would be the minimum requirement. And of course we can't. We can't even do it in urban areas, let alone rural and remote areas where it's very difficult to access good palliative care. Can we assure that voluntary assisted death could be a totally autonomous choice? Well, of course we can't, because legislation is a blunt instrument, and the sort of subtle pressures that could be put on by relatives or even the health system in an economically rational society where ensuring someone could live until they die might be quite an expensive business. You can't ring-fence that. And just as an example, which I came across last week when we were in Rockhampton, I read a little news feed from Victoria that on a totally different topic altogether. It was on Victoria's laws about not using mobile phones when you're driving your motor car, which are very good laws. But just to prove that you can't legislate for something that doesn't have holes in it, somebody who probably had more time than they should have made the following argument. They said a drive-through of a fast food store is actually a public thoroughfare, which it is. If you have your motor running and you get out your mobile phone to pay for your food, you are breaking the law. Now, you know, it is actually true. The police came out and said, well, turn your motor off, and they got absolutely pilloried for that because somebody had found a silly exception to a law that was otherwise very sensible. Well, what we're saying here is I don't think you can make the one assurance that you want, and that there wouldn't be some wrongful deaths or subtle coercions. How can the law protect a vulnerable patient who simply wants to live until they die from that? And I don't think they can. And then the difficult thing I have with the Victorian legislation is you're not allowed to write that voluntary assisted death was the cause of death on the death certificate. Well, what sort of deception is that? That to me shows that there's a sense of unease about the whole thing in the background there. So I've already mentioned passive euthanasia. In medicine, knowing when to treat is important, but knowing when not to treat is even more important for the quality of life. And I'm a cancer doctor, and knowing when not to give chemotherapy or when to stop chemotherapy so that you ensure the quality because you withdraw burdensome side effects when it's ineffective is just part of routine care. And the same thing happens towards the end of life, where something that you've instituted that's no longer going to preserve that life but is burdensome can be withdrawn. That is no form of euthanasia at all. It's just part of the difficult medical decision making, usually in consultation with the patient, that occurs. So removing a futile treatment is no form of euthanasia. And if you want to, and the philosopher Philippa put this example, if you want to test whether you really are removing a treatment or trying to kill someone, if you remove the treatment and the patient's still alive, do you seek to cause their death by another means? Well, of course you don't. And so it's really a term we shouldn't use, because it's just trying to use the same euthanasia term to say, well, you support that form of euthanasia, why don't you support all of them? So I've talked about withdrawing treatment, and no doctor is obligated to provide a treatment that's ineffective or harmful, and we've got to counsel patients about when a treatment becomes futile. I'll tell you what's never futile, and that is a treatment that's designed to control symptoms, because we must try and make people as comfortable as possible. We can use opiates, we can use other things, but that's not a futile treatment. Now, I don't want to go into this, but you can actually quantitate. Some people have tried to. If it doesn't work more than 3% of the time, it's futile. If it hasn't worked for the last 100 times, I don't know why you'd go to 100, but it is futile. And so there's all sorts of things. And even back in the old days of Plato, they talked about if a treatment fails to release a patient from being preoccupied with the illness and is incapable of achieving any other life goal, then it should be regarded as futile. So the idea of futile treatment and withdrawing it's been for a long time and is part of regular and good patient care. Why do we value life? I mean, if you're talking about euthanasia, let's go on to the positive. Why do we value life? Well, in the Judeo-Christian view, it's very simply human life is valuable because it's God-given and valued by God. It comes to as simple as that. But that's not the only formulation of that. In the philosophical literature, people like Immanuel Kant, he thought life was valuable because human beings were rational and were able to make moral decisions, and that gave them the value to make sure they were never used as means, they were always ends. In other words, killing a human to achieve another end is not how you would treat a rational being. So there are other arguments other than the religious argument for valuing life that are out there, and if somebody subscribes to them, then they ought to be able to understand a high value on life, on human beings. What about death? Well, the definition of death is quite difficult, actually. I mean, the first and the biggest thing about the definition of human death is it has to have a component of irreversibility. There's no sense in which you can be dead and then the next minute alive unless it's miraculous. And of course, that was the whole business, the resurrection of Christ. It was against what happens to human beings. It was divine and it was miraculous. But in our human definition of death, we're looking for irreversibility. But we haven't always accepted the same view of death. I mean, in the old days, you were dead when your heart stopped beating. But when we started to need to keep hearts beating for organ transplantation, or when we started to put people on ventilators, which kept lungs going and hearts beating, then we had to have another view of death, and we had to make death centred on what was happening into the brain. Which was a little bit more difficult to judge. Any man in the street could feel the pulse, but to judge whether someone's irreversibly brain dead is more difficult. Just to show us, in society, as we've developed tools and so on, we've had to change our view of death. And I think the problem is that there is no biological point which has intrinsic moral significance. What we regard as death is we've defined as death, and we've changed it because there was nothing, intrinsically moral about the heart stopping. It was just a convenient way of measuring whether someone was dead or not. And there are other definitions of dead. Sociologically, sociologically, you're dead when the doctor says you're dead because that's what society has said. If he signs the death certificate, you're dead. So there's all sorts of definitions of death, and I think it's important to... go back. Can we go back one? Oh, there we are. Now, when I talk about the sort of arguments that we can use in the sort of secular world, there was a philosopher called Philip Devine, of all names, and he wrote a book called The Logical Opaqueness of Death. And what he was saying, he said, look, you can't make, he called it a rational decision, but you can't make a balanced decision to take your life, because to make a balanced decision, you need to know as much about one side of what you're deciding as the other. And we all know about life, but none of us actually know about death. We might have a faith of what death is. We might take a gamble that death is going to be better than life, but we can't know it. So how can you possibly make a reasoned decision to choose death? So there's a sort of a powerful sort of logical argument where choosing death would not be appropriate. And the other issue is that what does it mean in sort of philosophical terms if we support euthanasia? What it means is that we're putting our own autonomous decision-making, our ability to determine what we're going to do, ahead of life itself. And that's a fairly sort of tenuous proposition, because autonomy requires life. If you're dead, you can no longer make autonomous decisions. So there's an inconsistency if we think our autonomy to choose death is more important than being alive. It's an inconsistent argument. What we're actually asked to balance often is a life that is poor quality with death. And you see this often. You get cases of someone that's in a lot of pain or something like that. Surely it's the compassionate thing that they could die. But in fact, what's driving this is the idea that the only way of reversing something of poor quality is death, and it isn't. The way to reverse something of poor quality is to replace it with something of better quality, and that's of course what palliative care and counselling attempts to do when illness is causing issues that are difficult to control. So it's setting up an argument that's not right, although there's only one alternative to a life of poor quality, and that is death, and that is by no means correct at all. And the thing that's most often used, because it's easy for everyone to understand, is pain. Now, pain is actually not the worst of symptoms I've come across. I think people that are chronically fatigued and barely can get up in the morning have a worse quality of life than some people in pain. And I think people who are incredibly breathless can have a worse quality of life. Pain's the one used. And what we see in the secular world, and I used to use this as a theoretical example until I actually ran the New York Marathon a couple of years ago, and Wendy's going to do one eventually. I think I've talked her into it. And I ran, that's actually me finishing Melbourne last year. I wasn't all that well, but the point is, when you get to about 35 kilometres out of the 42, you have this phenomena called hitting the wall, which is one of the most painful sort of things. Your muscles cramp and so on. Now, you could stop there, but you don't, because you run on to achieve the goal that you had, to conquer one of athletics' challenges. And so it doesn't sort of make sense that that pain or something like that, a physical symptom, should be the arbiter of whether you live or die. And what do we actually look at? Well, we look at other things that people can do, and this is what palliative care and this is what counselling towards the end of life can bring out. What will make your life valuable, even if, and it's only a few % where palliative care these days can't conquer pain, what would make your life valuable? And sometimes people towards the end of their life refocus on relationships and try and heal things that they've either been too busy or too careless during life to heal. Some people, for the first time, relieved of the physical, actually managed to concentrate on the spiritual for the first time. So there are other things to do that are beyond pain. And when I was doing my PhD, I keep seeing myself instead of the next thing, which is frightening. When I tried to sort of make this argument, I wanted to sort of try and get at what made a rich life and a poor life. It wasn't just the absence of pain. I think what makes a rich life is that we have plenty of options. We can have plenty of choices about what we do, when we do it, who we do it with. What makes a poor life is when your options are limited, either because of poverty or because of disease or because of bad luck or whatever. And so when you're comparing a rich life to a poor life and you decide that the answer to a poor life is death, death forecloses all options. You've got no options left. So why would that be a good choice? Wouldn't it be better to have some options and try and increase them? So let's go back to that. So palliative care, it's usually suggested that in pain you can get rid of it in about 95%, but in the 5%, the counselling is very important. And the trouble is people don't always know all of their options. When I was years ago working at Peter MacCallum Cancer Institute in Melbourne, I came across Jean Milne, who was a pastoral counsellor. She used to be actually a radiation therapist for decades, and when she finished doing that, she knew so much about cancer and she'd met so many patients, she went into counselling. And she used to liken euthanasia as tearing the last page out of a novel. And the reason she did that is she said there's a lot of good stuff written on that page, both for the people and for their relatives. And in fact, what this is about is there's a lot of options for living life to the full. John 10:10, Christ came that we may have life and live it to the full. And I want to tell you an example of a case, and I know, cases, unless they're generalisable, don't stand up. But this is a case that influenced me quite a lot. And it's the case of a woman in her 40s who worked in a dress shop on the Mornington Peninsula in Victoria, and she had 3 teenage daughters, and she presented with bowel cancer that had spread to the liver. And this is a fairly dire situation. In those days, we didn't have a lot of chemotherapy. We gave her the chemotherapy we had, and she responded, and the liver lesion shrank, and she went back to working in the dress shop and looking after her family. And about 18 months later, she came back and the disease had started to grow again. In actual fact, we had an experimental treatment and we treated her, and to our great joy, she responded again. But this time only for about 6 months. And when she came back next time, she was in really bad condition. She was lying in bed. She had disease that had not only spread to the liver, it had spread to the lungs. And she said to us, look, I've discussed it with my family. I've got nothing more to offer them. I can't actually do anything more for them anymore, and I want to die. And so I said to her, look, euthanasia at that time in Victoria was illegal, and I said, but we're not going to hide behind that. I want to know why you want to die. And she said, well, I've told you, I can't do anything more for my family. And the second thing we elicited from her is when she found she had lung problems, she'd watched her father die a miserable death of breathlessness from lung cancer, and she didn't want that to be her. So we did two things. The first thing we did is we absolutely assured her with the proper use of drugs and so on that we could make sure she didn't have that sort of death with the air hunger and so on. But the second thing she didn't know, and this is where you don't always know your options, is her younger daughter was having a lot of trouble with the grief over her mother dying. And the problem was she'd watched her mother come into our hospital, get better and go home twice. And she was really down on us for not being able to achieve that again. And she screamed at the nurses and she screamed at the doctors, and it was very unpleasant. So I went in and told that mother, your daughter needs more time with you. The mother immediately withdrew her request for euthanasia, and she died 5 days later. The daughter spent much of that time with her, and by the time she died, the daughter was having, a normal grief reaction. And that's what counselling and so on does at the end of life. What would make the rest of your life valuable? And, it'll be different things for different people. But I think that was a very powerful example of where we can't just make assumptions. The other issue that I just want to briefly touch on, I started at the beginning to talk about with my Victorian case, can we actually legislate for euthanasia? Well, I think although there may be rare cases with unmanageable symptoms, what we're looking at is legislating for a very small minority, if that was the case, but putting at risk a majority of people who may wish to live life to the full until they die. This is not death denying. This is actually living life to the full till you die. And why it's particularly problematic in our current society is we live in an economically rationalist society. And healthcare resources are taking up really far too much of our budget, if you like, because we've got very expensive healthcare. And what sort of pressure can the system put on if you allow euthanasia in this sort of economically rational society to put a lot of resources into someone who is dying? The only other quick example that I want to give is when I used to give these talks, and the euthanasia debate comes around every decade or two, and you find you give some talks. And I used to go to churches and give these talks, and they always used to give me a similar example, and that was, someone who'd been the pillar of the church, the organist, taught Sunday school, did this, did that, and so on, and now she was in a nursing home rocking away in the window. And surely, her life is now dreadful. I feel very uncomfortable about her because look at what she used to be. And I said, look, just because her life now isn't what it was when she was the pillar of the church, does that mean she deserves to die? She could be sitting there, and as long as she was fed and dry, she could be rocking away, reliving over and over again her best memories, for all I know. But it doesn't mean she deserves to die just because she wasn't like she was last time. And I think we've got to... I think we've got to be able to, work through those difficult examples. And so I want to leave you with one thing that I learnt from this debate, and it comes from the example of the woman, and it comes from other sources as well. I was always very sad when people thought that their value in this world was only when they were doing things for others, and that they didn't have intrinsic value, and that people didn't value them for just being. And I've sort of made it my mission to tell people that before they're in the situation when they're dying. You are all valuable for being. Delight in that. God loves you and God values you, and that's the most powerful argument, I think, against introducing legislation to take your life earlier. Thank you.